February 19th, 1945. Green Beach 1, Iwo Jima, 0900 hours. Corporal Tony Stein hits the black volcanic sand carrying 25 pounds of unauthorized weaponry that, according to Marine Corps regulations, should not exist. The gun in his hands is firing 1,350 rounds per minute, more than double the rate of every other machine gun on that beach. It's tearing through Japanese pillboxes like wet cardboard. And technically, it's illegal. 3 months earlier, in a maintenance tent on Hawaii, 2 Marines Sergeant Milan Grevich and Private First Class John Lyttle had committed what could charitably be called creative insubordination. They'd taken aircraft machine guns from wrecked Navy planes, stripped them down to their firing mechanisms, and rebuilt them as man-portable weapons using parts scavenged from 5 different military systems. No authorization, no official approval, just 2 toolmakers who decided that watching brothers die because their machine guns couldn't deliver enough firepower was unacceptable. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The weapon Stein is using doesn't appear in any Marine Corps table of organization. It has no official designation. The other Marines call it the Stinger, and by the end of this day, it will have killed more than 20 Japanese soldiers, saved dozens of American lives, and proven that sometimes the best military innovation comes from the people least authorized to innovate. This is the story of how 3 Marines broke every rule in the book to build a weapon the Corps didn't want, command didn't approve, and that became one of the most effective killing tools on the most important island in the Pacific War. But to understand why they built it, you first need to understand what was killing Marines in 1944 and 1945. The problem wasn't tactics, it wasn't training, it wasn't even Japanese defensive preparation, though that was formidable. The problem was mathematics. Rate of fire mathematics that made suppressive fire impossible and assault tactics suicidal. The standard Marine Corps light machine gun in 1944 was the Browning M1919A4. Designated weight, 31 pounds without tripod. Cyclic rate of fire, 400 to 600 rounds per minute. Effective range, 1,000 yards. On paper, it was a magnificent weapon. John Browning's design was mechanically perfect. Air-cooled, recoil-operated, belt-fed. It had proven itself in combat from World War I through the Pacific Island campaigns. The M1919A4 was reliable, durable, and beloved by armourers because it almost never broke. Here's what that meant in combat. A trained crew could sustain fire at roughly 125 rounds per minute without overheating the Crafer barrel. In a 3-second burst, the weapon would fire 30 rounds. 30 rounds across a 60-degree arc of fire meant 1 bullet every 2 degrees. Against entrenched Japanese positions with firing ports measuring 6 inches across at ranges of 50 to 100 yards, a 6-inch opening subtended less than half a degree of arc. You needed sustained fire, volume fire, a wall of bullets so dense that no defender could expose themselves without taking a round. The M1919A4 couldn't deliver that. It could suppress a general area. It could keep heads down if you fired long bursts. But against prepared positions, hardened bunkers, coconut log pillboxes reinforced with coral and volcanic rock, the Japanese could time the weapon. They'd learned to listen for the rhythm, the cyclic rate, the pauses when the gun shifted positions or when belt changes happened. In that half-second, when the gun went silent, they'd return fire. 3-man machine gun teams were dying at catastrophic rates. Guadalcanal taught the first lesson. Tarawa reinforced it. Saipan made it brutal. By the time Marines hit Peleliu in September of 1944, everyone understood the equation. Japanese defensive doctrine had evolved. They'd abandoned banzai charges. They'd stopped trying to hold the beaches. Instead, they fortified interior positions, caves, bunkers, underground complexes, and forced American infantry to assault prepared positions at close range. Every pillbox became a killing zone. A Marine rifle platoon attacking a fortified position needed suppressive fire. Not just fire, suppressive fire. Fire so intense and continuous that defenders couldn't man their weapons. Standard doctrine called for machine gun teams to deliver suppressive fire while rifle squads maneuvered. But the M1919's rate of fire wasn't suppressive enough, not against defenders who'd learned to exploit the weapon's rhythm. Japanese gunners would wait for the inevitable, pause the 2-second gap when a Marine gunner shifted aim or when the assistant gunner fed in a new belt, and in that pause, they'd fire. A burst from a Nambu Type 92 would cut down the advancing rifleman, or worse, target the machine gun crew itself. The casualty statistics told the story that command didn't want to acknowledge. In the campaign for Peleliu, 1st Marine Division lost 1,542 killed and 6,526 wounded over 73 days of fighting. The island measured 6 square miles. Do the math. That's 260 casualties per square mile. Every inch of ground cost blood, and a disproportionate number of those casualties came during the assault phase, when rifle squads were most exposed and machine gun suppression was most critical. Marine rifle companies carried 2 M1919A4s per weapons platoon, 6 guns per company, 18 per battalion, against an enemy who'd had 3 years to study American doctrine and build defenses specifically designed to defeat it. 18 machine guns firing 600 rounds per minute weren't enough. But that's what the tables of organization authorized. That's what logistics delivered. That's what armorers maintained. So that's what Marines died carrying. By late 1944, Marines in the Pacific were searching for solutions. Not officially, not through channels, but in maintenance tents and supply depots, and anywhere 2 or more enlisted men with mechanical aptitude got together to discuss the very specific problem of our guns don't shoot fast enough. The discussion all circled back to the same conclusion. The Marine Corps had access to weapons that fired faster, aircraft machine guns. Specifically, the Browning AN/M 230 caliber aircraft machine gun. The AN/M2 was a beautiful piece of engineering insanity. Take John Browning's M1917 water-cooled machine gun. Remove the water, jack it because aircraft don't have time for that. Thin the barrel to half the diameter to save weight. Lighten the receiver walls. Reduce every component to minimum structural integrity. Then crank the cyclic rate to 1,200 rounds per minute because aerial combat happens in 3-second bursts, and you need to put as many rounds into a target as physically possible before it vanishes from your gun sight. The result was a weapon that weighed 17 pounds, half the weight of an M1919, and fired twice as fast. It had exactly 3 applications: fixed mount in fighter wings, flexible mount in bomber turrets, and absolutely nowhere else, because the moment you tried to fire it on the ground without an aircraft slipstream cooling the barrel, it would overheat catastrophically within seconds. Well, almost absolutely nowhere else. Private William Bill Colby had been the first to try. Bougainville, 1943. Colby was a Marine rifleman with the 1st Parachute Battalion who'd noticed that crashed dive bombers left perfectly functional AN/M2s scattered across the island. Someone needed those guns. The Japanese certainly weren't going to recover them. So Colby, operating on the ancient Marine principle of better to ask forgiveness than permission, liberated several aircraft machine guns from wrecked Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers and set them up in fixed defensive positions around the battalion's perimeter. Fixed positions, that was the critical constraint. You could fire an AN/M2 from a stationary mount, set it on sandbags, brace it against a log, let the ambient air cool the barrel between bursts. What you couldn't do was carry it. The aircraft gun had no stock, no sights, no bipod, no trigger mechanism an infantryman could operate. The firing controls were spade grips and a thumb trigger designed for gunners sitting in aircraft turrets. You needed both hands just to hold the weapon, which meant you needed a second person to aim and a third to feed ammunition. And if you wanted to move it, You needed to wait 15 minutes for the barrel to cool enough that touching it wouldn't require skin grafts. But it worked. 1,200 rounds per minute of suppressive fire was genuinely suppressive. Japanese infiltration attempts against positions defended by Colby's improvised guns failed spectacularly. The volume of fire was devastating. Psychologically, it broke enemy momentum. Tactically, it gave Marines breathing room. And most importantly, it proved the concept. AN/M2 machine guns could function in ground combat if you solved the mobility problem. Colby's experiment got noticed, not by command, by other Marines with mechanical skills who understood that the difference between 600 and 1,200 rounds per minute was the difference between their brothers coming home or being zipped into body bags. Sergeant Milan Mel Grevich was one of those Marines. 24 years old, originally from Pennsylvania, Grevich had trained as a machinist before the war. He'd enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1942 and gone through parachute training at Camp Gillespie. By 1944, he was a machine gunner with the 1st Parachute Regiment and had seen Colby's fixed-position AN/M2s deliver firepower that standard Marine weapons couldn't match. When the Paramarines disbanded in February of 1944 and Grevich got reassigned to 5th Marine Division, he brought with him an idea that had been percolating for months. Make the aircraft gun portable. At Camp Tarawa, Hawaii, in November of 1944, Grevich found his collaborator. Private First Class John Lyttle was another pre-war machinist turned Marine. Like Grevich, Lyttle understood weapons systems from the engineering side. He didn't just know how to shoot a machine gun, he knew why it worked. He understood gas systems and recoil mechanisms and heat dissipation and all the unglamorous mechanical details that separated functional weapons from paperweights. The two men started meeting after duty hours in the battalion maintenance area. No official authorization. No orders to develop new weapons systems. Just two Marines with access to machine tools and a conviction that they could build something better than what tables of organization provided. Their starting material came from Naval Air Station Kaneohe Bay, where damaged aircraft from carrier operations got stripped for parts. Wrecked Dauntless dive bombers and Hellcat fighters came in regularly. Some had taken anti-aircraft fire, some had crashed on landing. All of them had perfectly functional AN/M2 machine guns that the Navy was going to scrap because repairing aircraft weapons cost more than building new ones. Grevich and Lyttle acquired 6 AN/M2 machine guns. How they acquired them depends on which account you believe. Official requisition forms were probably not involved. What matters is that by late November, they had 6 aircraft machine guns in their possession and a clear vision of how to make them work as infantry weapons. The first problem was the stock. Aircraft machine guns don't need stocks because they're bolted to aircraft. To make an infantryman's weapon, you needed something to brace against your shoulder. The obvious solution was scavenged stocks from existing rifles. The M1 Garand rifle was perfect standard issue, wooden, durable, with enough mass to absorb recoil. Except Garand stocks were the wrong shape entirely. The AN/M2's receiver and buffer tube system had a completely different geometry than an M1 rifle. The buffer tube protruded several inches behind the receiver in a cylindrical housing that no Garand stock would accommodate. Grevich and Lyttle solved this by cutting down Garand stocks, hollowing out the interior to accept the buffer tube, and then fabricating custom metal adapters to bolt the modified stock to the aircraft gun's receiver. This wasn't simple carpentry. This was precision fitting. The buffer tube had to remain perfectly aligned, or the weapon would jam. The stock had to be solid enough to handle sustained recoil without cracking, and the whole assembly had to survive combat abuse without falling apart. The trigger mechanism was the second problem. Aircraft machine guns used solenoid triggers, electrical firing systems designed for pilots to activate with a button on the control stick. Infantry weapons needed mechanical triggers. Grevich and Lyttle fabricated trigger assemblies from sheet metal, creating a simple lever mechanism that connected to the aircraft gun's firing solenoid. Pull the trigger, complete the electrical circuit, weapon fires. Elegant in its simplicity, horrifyingly unreliable if you got any moisture in the electrical components. But it worked. Sights were the third problem. Aircraft guns used tracers and visual observation. Infantry weapons needed iron sights for aimed fire. The AN/M2 had mounting points on its top plate where aircraft sighting systems attached, but those systems weren't designed for shoulder-fired weapons. Grevich and Lyttle tried several solutions. Some accounts say they used Browning automatic rifle sights. Others mention modified M2 heavy machine gun sights. The photographic evidence, 2 grainy images of Grevich holding a completed Stinger, is inconclusive. What's clear is that they fabricated some kind of rear sight assembly with windage adjustment and mounted it to the weapon's top plate using screws. The bipod solved itself. Browning automatic rifles used a simple folding bipod that attached to the gas cylinder. The AN/M2's gas cylinder had similar dimensions. Minor modification with a hacksaw and a drill press, and BAR bipods fit perfectly. The carrying handle came from the aircraft gun itself, one of the spade grip handles, repositioned and modified to mount on top of the receiver. By early December, Grevich and Lyttle had a working prototype. Weight, 25 pounds, fully loaded. Length, approximately 40 inches. Cyclic rate, 1,200 to 1,500 rounds per minute. Fed from standard 30 caliber ammunition belts loaded into a 100-round box magazine adapted from aircraft use. Effective range, 300 yards before dispersion made aimed fire pointless. Barrel life, approximately 2,000 rounds before overheating required barrel changes. On paper, it was a terrible weapon. Too heavy for a rifle, too light for sustained fire, no spare barrels, no water cooling. The stock was makeshift. The trigger was unreliable. The sights were improvised. The whole contraption looked like someone had welded a rifle to an aircraft gun because that's exactly what they'd done. But it fired twice as fast as anything else Marines carried into combat. And in 1945, fighting Japanese defenders who'd fortified Iwo Jima with 18 miles of tunnels and 11,000 prepared defensive positions, twice as fast, was the difference between mission success and catastrophic casualties. Grevich and Lyttle built 6 weapons. They called them Stingers, after the firepower they delivered quite a sting in the phrase one Marine used. 5 went to designated machine gunners in Company G, 28th Marines. The 6th went to Corporal Tony Stein, Company A. This is where the story gets interesting. Not because of the technical achievement, though converting aircraft guns to infantry weapons was legitimately impressive, but because of what happened when Marines started asking questions. Questions like, who authorized this? And where are the requisition forms? And, do you understand that modifying military equipment without approval violates approximately 7 different articles of the Uniform Code of Military Justice? The official Marine Corps response to unauthorized weapons modifications was straightforward. Don't do it, ever, for any reason. The Corps maintained strict protocols for weapons issue, maintenance, and modification. Every weapon had a serial number. Every serial number appeared on property books. Every property book got audited. Armourers who modified weapons without written authorization from battalion ordnance officers faced court-martial. The reasoning was sound. Standardization kept supply chains functional. If every unit modified their weapons differently, you'd need custom parts for every variation. Training became impossible. Safety inspections became meaningless. And God help you if a modified weapon failed in combat and killed the Marine carrying it, because now you're explaining to a family why their son died using an unauthorized weapon that never should have existed. 5th Marine Division had clear policies. Weapons modifications required written requests submitted through the chain of command to division ordnance. Requests included technical specifications, safety testing documentation, and justification for why standard issue weapons were inadequate. The review process took minimum 6 weeks. Most requests got denied. Some got ignored. Almost none got approved for field use before extensive testing at stateside facilities. Grevich and Lyttle had submitted exactly 0 requests. They'd built 6 machine guns in a maintenance tent using scavenged parts and told precisely nobody in their chain of command until the weapons were complete. This was not how the Marine Corps operated. This was how you got assigned to permanent latrine duty, assuming you didn't get court-martialed first. But here's what saved them. 5th Marine Division was preparing for the largest amphibious assault in Marine Corps history, Iwo Jima. Intelligence estimates predicted the island held 21,000 Japanese defenders in the most heavily fortified position American forces had yet encountered. Casualty projections were horrifying. 30% losses in the first 48 hours, total casualties approaching 50% over the course of the campaign. These weren't wild guesses. These were calculated estimates based on previous island assaults, Japanese defensive doctrine, and aerial reconnaissance showing defensive preparations that made Peleliu look like a practice exercise. Every Marine in 5th Division understood they were sailing toward a meat grinder. Officers weren't interested in enforcing regulations for the sake of regulations. They were interested in firepower. Anything that helped Marines survive got serious consideration, even if it violated every protocol in the book. When Grevich and Lyttle presented their completed stingers to their company commander, Captain Arthur Naylor, they expected a rest. What they got was 5 minutes of questions. How much does it weigh? How fast does it fire? How reliable is it? Have you test-fired it? How many rounds before the barrel fails? Grevich answered honestly. 25 pounds, 1,200 rounds per minute. Reasonably reliable if you kept the electrical connections dry. Yes, they'd test-fired all 6 weapons. Approximately 2,000 rounds before overheating became dangerous, maybe 3,000 if you fired in short bursts. Naylor asked one more question. Can you make more before we ship out? Grevich said no. They'd used all the available aircraft guns from the Navy salvage yard. Building more would require official requisitions, which would mean explaining to supply why they needed aircraft weapons for ground combat, which would mean admitting they'd already built 6 unauthorized machine guns, which would mean court-martial. Naylor thought for approximately 10 seconds. Then he said, "You built these on your own initiative without orders?" "Yes, sir. I never saw them. Battalion Ordnance never saw them. As far as official records show, these weapons don't exist. If they fail in combat and someone gets hurt, this conversation never happened, and you're facing charges. Understood?" "Yes, sir. Get them to the machine gun section. Tell them to test fire every weapon until they're confident it won't blow up in their face. If anyone asks, they found them in captured Japanese supplies." This was technically a crime. Captain Naylor had just authorized use of unregistered weapon systems in combat operations. But 5th Marine Division was 3 weeks from loading onto ships bound for Iwo Jima, and Naylor had watched machine gun teams die on Peleliu because their weapons couldn't deliver enough suppressive fire. 6 unauthorized machine guns firing 1,200 rounds per minute suddenly seemed like the least criminal thing happening in preparation for an assault that would kill 7,000 Americans. The Stingers went to Company G's machine gun section, 5 weapons for 5 designated gunners. The 6th weapon went to Corporal Tony Stein, and there's some dispute about why. Stein wasn't in Company G, he was Company A, 1st Battalion, 28th Marines. Different company, different battalion, technically different command structure entirely. But Stein was a toolmaker. Pre-war, he'd worked as a machinist in Dayton, Ohio. He understood metal fabrication, tolerances, mechanical systems. When Grevich and Lyttle were building their Stingers, Stein had been helping, not officially, not as part of any work order. But in the way that skilled tradesmen gravitate toward interesting projects, Stein had spent evenings in the maintenance tent offering suggestions, checking tolerances, helping fit the Garand stocks to the aircraft receiver tubes. The compensation for that assistance was weapon number 6. When Company A loaded onto transport ships in January of 1945, Corporal Tony Stein carried a 25-pound machine gun that officially did not exist. bound for an island where he would use it to kill more enemy soldiers in one day than most Marines killed in entire campaigns. But before we get to Iwo Jima, we need to understand what the Stinger actually did that standard Marine weapons couldn't. Because fires faster is technically true but misses the crucial tactical advantage. The Stinger didn't just fire faster. It delivered sustained suppressive fire at rates that fundamentally changed small unit tactics. Standard Marine doctrine for assaulting fortified positions went like this. Machine gun team sets up. Gunner identifies target. Assistant gunner feeds ammunition. Gunner fires burst 3 to 5 seconds, 15 to 30 rounds. Riflemen advance during the burst. Machine gun shifts fire to next target. Repeat until objective secured or everyone's dead. The problem was timing. 3 to 5 seconds of suppressive fire gives riflemen maybe 15 yards of advance before they're exposed again. Against Japanese defenders who'd trained specifically to exploit this rhythm, 15 yards wasn't enough. Defenders would wait and for the machine gun to shift targets, then immediately return fire. The advancing riflemen were caught in the open with no cover. The Stinger changed that math. 1,200 rounds per minute meant 100 rounds in 5 seconds. 100 rounds across a 60-degree arc created genuine suppression. Defenders couldn't expose themselves, couldn't return fire, couldn't even peek out to observe because the volume of fire was so intense that any exposure meant immediate death. More importantly, the Stinger could sustain fire longer between barrel changes. The M1919A4 needed barrel changes after 250 rounds of sustained fire, roughly 2 minutes. The Stinger, despite having a lighter barrel, could actually fire longer bursts because its higher cyclic rate meant the weapon spent less total time firing. Fire 100 rounds at 1,200 rounds per minute and you've only been firing for 5 seconds. Fire 100 rounds at 600 rounds per minute and you've been firing for 10 seconds. Less time firing meant less heat build-up, which paradoxically meant the lighter barrel could handle longer engagements. There was a catch, naturally. The ammunition consumption was catastrophic. Standard Marine doctrine allocated 1,800 rounds per machine gun per day of combat. That was 3 full belts, enough for sustained operations. A Stinger could burn through 1,800 rounds in 90 seconds of continuous fire. In practical terms, a Stinger gunner would exhaust his basic load before the first objective was secure. Which brings us to the real genius of Grevich's design. He hadn't built a sustained fire support weapon, he'd built an assault weapon. Something you carried into close combat, used to break enemy resistance at point-blank range, then immediately resupplied. It was the spiritual ancestor of the modern squad automatic weapon portable firepower, designed for offensive operations, not defensive. Positions. The Marines who carried Stingers understood this intuitively. These weren't suppression weapons. These were door-kicking weapons. You charged a pillbox, fired until the defenders were dead or suppressed, then someone else brought ammunition while you moved to the next target. It was aggressive, violent, and consumed resources at rates that would horrify any supply officer. It was also devastatingly effective. 5th Marine Division conducted exactly 0 official tests. There was no time. In late January of 1945, the division boarded transport ships and sailed for Iwo Jima. Somewhere in the Pacific, 6 Marines carried machine guns that weighed 25 pounds and fired 1,350 rounds per minute, and every officer who knew about them had made the calculated decision that unauthorized weapons were better than insufficient firepower. February 19th, 1945. D-Day for Operation Detachment. The assault on Iwo Jima. 5th Marine. Division hit Green Beach and Red Beach on the southern end of the island, just below Mount Suribachi. 4th Marine Division landed to the north. 30,000 Marines hitting an 8-square-mile island, defended by 21,000 Japanese soldiers who'd spent 8 months preparing defences. The beach was volcanic ash, black sand that collapsed under your feet, making it impossible to run. Every step forward was like climbing uphill through loose gravel. Navy bombardment had cratered the beach, but hadn't touched the Japanese defensive positions, concrete pillboxes and bunkers built into the base of Suribachi, with interlocking fields of fire covering every approach. Corporal Tony Stein hit Green Beach in the first wave. 24 years old, carrying a stinger and wearing a pack loaded with 500 rounds of linked .30 caliber ammunition. The moment his boots touched volcanic sand, Japanese defenders opened fire from positions the Navy bombardment had completely missed. Machine gun fire raked the beach from multiple angles. Marines went down before they made it 10 feet inland. Stein didn't hesitate. According to his Medal of Honor citation and the accounts of Marines who survived that day, he was the first man from his unit to establish a fighting position beyond the beach. Not at the beach. Beyond it. He pushed inland through machine gun fire, found cover behind a low rise, set up his stinger, and started returning fire. What happened next demonstrates why rate of fire matters more than anyone in Marine Corps ordnance understood. Japanese defenders were positioned in reinforced pillboxes, approximately 75 yards inland from Green Beach. These weren't field fortifications. These were engineered defensive positions, concrete walls 2 feet thick, firing ports 6 inches wide, overhead cover protecting against artillery. Standard doctrine said you assaulted these positions with flamethrowers or satchel charges, which meant closing, to within 20 feet while under fire from the pillbox and any supporting positions covering it. Stein assaulted them with suppressive fire. He would identify a pillbox, set up his stinger, and fire sustained bursts directly at the firing port. 100 rounds in 5 seconds. The defenders couldn't return fire because leaning into their firing port meant exposing themselves to a stream of bullets so dense it was effectively a solid wall of lead. While the stinger suppressed the pillbox, Stein would advance sometimes alone, sometimes with other Marines from his platoon who realized what he was doing and followed. When he reached the pillbox, he'd transition to grenades or his sidearm to finish the defenders. Then he'd reposition, acquire another target, and repeat the process. Within the first hour of the assault, Stein had personally neutralized multiple pillboxes and killed at least 20 Japanese defenders. But here's the problem with firing 1,200 rounds per minute. You exhaust ammunition in minutes, not hours. Standard combat load for a machine gunner was 500 rounds. Stein burned through that in his first 30 minutes of combat. His assistant gunner carried another 500 rounds, gone in the next 30 minutes. Every Marine in the platoon who could spare linked ammunition passed their belts to Stein. Still not enough. So Stein did something that sounds insane until you understand the tactical situation. He started running back to the beach to get more ammunition. Not walking, running. 8 separate trips, according to witnesses. Each trip approximately 150 yards. Round trip across open volcanic ash under intermittent Japanese fire. He'd reach the beach, grab ammunition from supplies still being unloaded, and run back to the front line. The first trip, he wore his helmet and boots. By the third trip, he'd kicked off his boots because running through volcanic ash was impossible with the extra weight. By the 5th trip, he'd ditched his helmet for the same reason. Picture this. A Marine corporal sprinting across a battlefield in socks, no helmet, carrying a 25-pound machine gun and 50-pound ammunition cans, making supply runs because his weapon fires so fast it outpaces standard logistics. And here's the detail that makes Tony Stein's Medal of Honor citation one of the most remarkable documents in Marine Corps history. Every trip back to the beach, Stein carried a wounded Marine, 8 trips for ammunition, 8 wounded Marines evacuated, while under fire, while carrying weapons and ammunition, while wearing no protective equipment because he'd stripped it off to move faster. This wasn't superhuman. This was math. Stein understood that his stinger was the most effective weapon on Green Beach. The only way to keep it functioning was continuous ammunition supply. The only way to maintain ammunition supply was for him personally to retrieve it, because asking someone else meant pulling them off the firing line. And if he was making trips to the beach anyway, carrying wounded Marines added maybe 30 seconds per trip while potentially saving their lives. By late afternoon on February 19th, Corporal Stein had killed more than 20 Japanese defenders, suppressed dozens of pillboxes, and enabled his platoon to advance nearly 500 yards inland from Green Beach. His Stinger had been shot out of his hands twice by enemy fire, literally struck by bullets while he was firing it, and both times he'd retrieved the weapon, checked that it still functioned, and resumed fire. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The other 5 Stingers saw similar use across Company G's sector. Sergeant Grevich carried his weapon throughout the assault, using it to suppress defensive positions while his machine gun section advanced. The technical problems, Grevich had worried about electrical trigger reliability, stock durability, barrel overheating proved manageable in actual combat. The triggers worked as long as Marines kept them dry. The stocks held up to sustained recoil. The barrels overheated but didn't fail, and Marines learned to fire in shorter bursts to manage heat. The ammunition consumption, however, was exactly as catastrophic as predicted. Each Stinger gunner required continuous resupply. Machine gun sections shifted their entire tactical approach. Standard practice was 2-man teams, gunner and assistant gunner. Stinger teams needed 4 or 5 Marines, 1 gunner, 1 assistant gunner, and 2 or 3 ammunition carriers whose only job was shuttling ammunition from beach supply dumps to wherever the Stinger was operating. It was logistically insane. It also worked. By the end of D-Day, 28th Marines had secured the southern tip of Iwo Jima and isolated Mount Suribachi. Casualties were heavy, approximately 500 killed and wounded out of 3,000 men, roughly 17%, but they'd achieved every D-Day objective, which was more than intelligence estimates had predicted. The volume of suppressive fire available to assault teams had made the difference between taking positions and dying in front of them. Now, here's where the story should end happily. Brilliant marine innovation saves lives. Command recognizes value of Stingers. Weapons get authorized for wider use. Tony Stein gets decorated. Grevich and Lyttle get commendations. The Stinger enters Marine Corps inventory as standard equipment. America wins the war. That's not what happened. What happened instead reveals something uncomfortable about military innovation. The Stinger worked brilliantly. Command hated it anyway. 5th Marine Division's after-action reports from Iwo Jima documented the Stinger's effectiveness. Officers who'd watched them in combat wrote detailed accounts of how 6 unauthorized weapons had delivered firepower that influenced tactical outcomes across an entire regiment's sector. The reports went to 3rd Amphibious Corps headquarters, from there to Fleet Marine Force Pacific, eventually to Headquarters Marine Corps in Washington. The response came back in March of 1945, while Marines were still fighting for Iwo Jima's northern plateau. Marine Corps Ordnance had reviewed the Stinger concept. Their conclusion: unauthorized weapons modifications violated regulations. The Stingers should be confiscated and destroyed. Any further modifications to standard-issue weapons without written authorization would result in court-martial. The reasoning in the official memorandum was technically sound. The Stingers had no documented safety testing, no spare parts inventory existed, no training protocols existed, no maintenance documentation existed. From a logistics standpoint, they were nightmares, custom weapons requiring custom support that diverted resources from standard equipment. More importantly, they were dangerous precedent. If Marines could modify weapons without authorization, where did it stop? Would every unit start customizing their rifles? Would armorers begin experimenting with ammunition loads? Would Marines start building improvised explosives because standard grenades weren't powerful enough? The Corps maintained strict weapons protocols for legitimate reasons, and unauthorized innovation, no matter how effective, undermined those protocols. There was another concern that nobody wrote in official documents, but everyone understood. The Stinger's ammunition consumption was genuinely unsustainable. Stein had burned through more than 2,000 rounds on D-Day alone. 6 Stingers firing at similar rates would consume 12,000 rounds per day of combat. A standard Marine rifle company was allocated approximately 25,000 rounds total for all weapons. 6 Stingers would consume half the company's ammunition at supply just to keep themselves fed. Scale that to division level, and the math became impossible. If 5th Marine Division equipped even 10% of its machine gunners with Stingers, ammunition requirements would exceed transport capacity. You'd need additional supply ships just to feed the weapons. In an amphibious campaign where every ton of shipping was calculated against fuel, food, medical supplies, and artillery ammunition, dedicating transport space to feed 6 experimental machine guns made no sense. So the order came down: confiscate the Stingers, return Marines to standard weapons, submit all unauthorized modifications to ordnance for review, which meant submit them for destruction. By the time that order reached 5th Marine Division in late March, Tony Stein was dead. March 1st, 1945, day 11 of the assault. 28th Marines were pushing north toward Hill 362A, one of the last major Japanese defensive positions on Iwo Jima. The fighting had transitioned from beach assault to grinding attrition, clearing bunkers, caves, and tunnel complexes foot by foot. Casualties were approaching 40%. Every rifle company was under strength. Every platoon was combat ineffective by doctrinal standards. Corporal Stein had been wounded on February 23rd during the assault on Mount Suribachi. Shrapnel wounds, bad enough that he'd been evacuated to a hospital ship offshore. He'd recovered enough to be released by February 28th. Standard procedure was to keep wounded Marines on the ship until their units rotated off the line for rest. Stein heard that Company A was taking heavy casualties attacking Hill 362A. He left the hospital ship and returned to his unit without authorization. On March 1st, Stein volunteered to lead a 19-man patrol to locate a machine gun emplacement that had Company A pinned down. He carried his Stinger. The patrol moved forward through broken terrain, trying to flank the Japanese position. They got within 50 yards before a sniper shot Corporal Tony Stein through the head. He died instantly, 24 years old. Medal of Honor recipient, though the award wouldn't be official until 1946. Marine corporal who'd used an unauthorized machine gun to kill more than 20 enemy soldiers and save dozens of American lives in a single day of combat. His Stinger disappeared. No record exists of what happened to the weapon after Stein's death. Most likely it was recovered by his platoon, used by another Marine for the remainder of the campaign, and then destroyed per division orders in April when the fighting ended. Sergeant Milan Grevich survived Iwo Jima. He carried his Stinger through the entire campaign. When division orders came down to confiscate unauthorized weapons, he supposedly turned in one of the aircraft guns, but kept detailed notes on how he'd built it. After the war, he returned to civilian life. He never spoke publicly about the Stinger, never sought recognition, never appeared in any of the official histories of Iwo Jima that mentioned Corporal Stein's personally improvised aircraft-type weapon. Private First Class John Lyttle also survived. Like Grevich, he returned to civilian life and said nothing about building weapons that saved Marine lives but violated every regulation in the book. The other 4 Stinger gunners from Company G survived the campaign. Their weapons were confiscated in April of 1945 and destroyed per ordnance orders. No official documentation recorded the weapons' serial numbers, specifications, or combat use. As far as Marine Corps records showed, the Stingers had never existed. Tony Stein's Medal of Honor citation, approved in 1946, contains exactly one reference to his weapon: personally improvised aircraft-type weapon. That's it. 8 words to describe a machine gun that 2 Marines had spent weeks building and that had fundamentally changed how an entire rifle company assaulted fortified positions. The citation doesn't name the weapon, doesn't describe how it was built, doesn't mention Grevich or Lyttle, doesn't acknowledge that Stein had carried an unauthorized weapon into combat, because officially, he hadn't. Officially, the Stinger didn't exist. Here's what bothers me about this story. Not the regulatory response that made sense from an institutional perspective. Not even the destruction of the weapons that followed standard protocol for unauthorized equipment. What bothers me is that the Marine Corps learned nothing from the Stinger's success. After Iwo Jima, Marines fought on Okinawa, same defensive doctrine, same heavily fortified positions. Same problem with insufficient suppressive fire from M1919 machine guns. Marines died assaulting pillboxes that Stingers could have suppressed. Nobody suggested building more Stingers. Nobody suggested adapting the concept into an authorized weapon system. The institutional response was to pretend the Stingers had never existed and continue issuing weapons that everyone knew were inadequate. It wasn't until 1947 that Marine Corps Ordnance began serious development of a lightweight, high-rate-of-fire machine gun for infantry use. The project eventually became the M1948 machine gun, which entered limited service in the early 1950s. It fired at rates comparable to the Stinger, around 900 to 1200 rounds per minute. It was lighter than the M1919. It was portable. It was basically everything the Stinger had been, except official. By the time the M1948 reached Marine units in Korea, Grevich and Lyttle had been out of the Corps for 6 years. Nobody asked them for input. Nobody acknowledged that 2 Marines with machine tools had solved in 1944 what ordnance took 7 years to develop. The M1948 itself had a short service life. It was replaced in the late 1950s by the M60 machine gun, which became the standard US military machine gun from Vietnam through Desert Storm. The M60 fired at 750 rounds per minute slower than the Stinger, but was lighter and more reliable. It stayed in service until 1994, when the military adopted the M240, which fires at around 650 rounds per minute. Notice the pattern. Every machine gun the U.S. military adopted after World War II fired faster than the M1919, but slower than the Stinger. The optimal rate of fire for a man-portable machine gun, as determined by decades of testing and combat experience, turned out to be somewhere between 700 and 900 rounds per minute. Exactly what you'd get if you took the Stinger's concept, lightweight, high cyclic rate, offensive firepower, and engineered it properly with spare parts, reliability testing, and sustainable ammunition consumption. Grevich and Lyttle had figured this out in 1944 using scavenged parts and hand tools. It took the US military 50 years to make it official. The Stinger's real legacy isn't the weapon itself. All 6 originals are gone, destroyed per regulations in 1945. A few replicas exist. Museums and collectors have built functional reproductions based on the 2 surviving photographs of Grevich holding his weapon. But the original Stingers, the ones that fought on Iwo Jima, are lost to history. The legacy is the principle. That sometimes the best military innovation comes from the people least authorized to innovate. That privates and sergeants with mechanical skills and combat experience can solve problems that generals and engineers miss. That regulations exist for good reasons, but following regulations isn't always the same as accomplishing the mission. The US military eventually learned this lesson. Sort of. Modern special operations forces have significantly more latitude to modify equipment and develop custom weapons. The Army's Asymmetric Warfare Group existed specifically to identify field innovations and fast-track them into official programs. The Marine Corps' Rapid Capabilities Office can approve new equipment in months instead of years. But those institutional changes came decades after World War II, and they came because enough people died using inadequate equipment that the military finally acknowledged that innovation from below wasn't just valuable, it was essential. Tony Stein never knew his Medal of Honor citation would inspire collectors to build replica Stingers. Never knew that military historians would spend decades analyzing his actions on February 19th. Never knew that his personally improvised aircraft-type weapon would become legendary in Marine Corps history, despite the Corps' best efforts to forget it existed. Sergeant Milan Grevich and Private First Class John Lyttle never received official recognition for building weapons that saved Marine lives. No medals, no commendations, no mention in Marine Corps history books. They violated regulation. The fact that their violation worked better than official equipment was irrelevant to the institutional response. Here's what the official histories don't capture. The moment on November, something in 1944, when Grevich and Lyttle looked at each other in a maintenance tent and decided that regulations were less important than keeping their brothers alive. The hours they spent after official duty hours, without orders, without authorization, building weapons they knew would get them court-martialed if anything went wrong. The calculated risk Captain Naylor took when he saw those weapons and decided, technically these don't exist, was the right answer. Or the 8 trips Tony Stein made across volcanic ash in his socks, carrying 50 pounds of ammunition and wounded Marines, because his weapon fired so fast that standard logistics couldn't keep it supplied. The moment he got shot on March 1st, knowing that the gun in his hands wasn't supposed to exist, that he'd carried it without authorization, that he'd violated regulations every single day he'd used it in combat. The uncomfortable truth is that institutional militaries resist innovation from below. Always have. Always will. The chain of command exists for good reasons. Standardization prevents chaos. Regulations save lives by preventing dangerous experimentation. But sometimes, not often, but sometimes the guy with a wrench and combat experience knows something that the guys at headquarters don't. The Stinger proved that Marines with machine tools could build better weapons than Marine Corps ordnance issued. The institutional response was to destroy the evidence and court-martial anyone who tried it again. It took 50 years, thousands of casualties, and multiple wars before the military developed doctrine that said, maybe we should listen to the privates occasionally. Modern squad automatic weapons, the M249, the M27 IAR, every lightweight machine gun currently in service owe their existence to the principle Milan Grevich and John Lyttle demonstrated in 1944. That infantry needs portable, high rate of fire suppressive weapons. That you can't assault fortified positions with 600 round per minute machine guns and expect acceptable casualties. That sometimes you need to break regulations to win fights. The Marine Corps didn't learn that lesson from the Stinger. They learned it from body counts in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. They learned it from after-action reports saying, our machine guns can't deliver enough firepower. They learned it from Marines dying in assaults that better weapons would have won. They could have learned it in 1945, from 6 machine guns built in a maintenance tent by 2 Marines who decided that unauthorized was better than inadequate. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.